to welcome you all to the Scottish American History Forum and wish you a heartfelt welcome. As you probably know, many of you, the History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division.
Connie, I accidentally put you on mute. I apologize. I'm sorry, Connie.
Just telling.
Hold on a second.
Connie, you're still on mute.
You're muted.
Can imagine how that happened. I didn't mute myself.
I tried to mute someone else and you popped up right as I apologize.
Okay, no problem. So I was just introducing the Scottish American History Forum, which is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots. And as I think many of you know, Chicago Scots was originally the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois, way back in 1845, later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, which is located in North Riverside, Illinois. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of the Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care Campus. And for additional information, we hope you'll all check out our website, which is easy, www.chicagoscots.org. And we hope everyone will be able to give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care Charity. Now, before we begin this morning, we are going to have question answer at the end with our esteemed guest. I was hoping Gus would be on to say a few words. Gus, are you on yet?
I am indeed, Connie. Good morning.
Oh, wonderful, welcome.
Good morning, and thanks to you. Thanks to everybody for joining this morning. I'm thoroughly looking forward to Cynthia's presentation today, and I hope everyone as well. I have a brief update or report to give everyone from Caledonia Senior Living, and an encouragement that if you haven't signed up to get your bivalent vaccine, please do. I signed up the other day and I'm in line to get my 5th shot, so I'll be, as we've been joking in the last couple of days, lean, mean and full of vaccine. Everything is well at Caledonia. We have seen some COVID related lockdowns and so on, but everybody's health remains good. We've managed to contain outbreaks where and when we've seen them. They've all been with staff who've brought them in from their outside lives. Unfortunately, none of the residents have tested positive, despite being tested twice a week, as long-term care does, and our commitment to testing has led us to. So the record of safety remains as good as anyone's in this particular field, and I credit my teammates for their vigilance, for their commitment to caring and commitment to certainty and science above everything else. It's led us to this position where I'm so proud of this community. And even as we open up to the outside world and visitors are coming in and we're returning to something of normal life, we've designed this protocol around COVID that is instantly scalable so that we can go into lockdown in a second. Constant reinvention and monitoring of the latest advice from health experts has kind of informed us all the way along the line, and will continue to do so. I thank everybody who's on the call today for your support, for your confidence and your kind words of encouragement that have really kept us going through this. And Connie, to yourself, thanks for leading this Scottish American History Forum, for your membership of the board and for your friendship. I appreciate it greatly.
Oh my goodness, Will, you couldn't be more welcome. And Gus, thank you for all the years of service as our president and chairman of the board, often of the Illinois St. Andrew Society and Chicago Scots, and overseeing Caledonia. And I think most of you are aware that Queen Elizabeth recently bestowed the OBE designation to Gus. So we're just really proud of you, Gus, and we're just grateful to have you as our leader.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And one quick word of encouragement to everyone. We have our Kilted Classic golf tournament coming up, which is, you know, Scotland has done many things for the world, as I'm sure Cynthia will talk about, and we've heard so many times during these history forums. But perhaps one of our greatest gifts to the world, or depending on your position on golf, Scotland's greatest curse on the world is the game of golf. And we really take it to town when we have our Kilted Classic. Golfers come in their tartans, many in their kilts, and you will see all sorts of Scottish trivia competitions, golf-related competitions, lots of history that is kind of told and shared through our golf tournament with trivia questions on tee boxes and answers on greens, and you can win a bottle of whiskey on every hole. You can win a trip to Scotland at this Kilted Classic, and also a set of beautiful custom-made golf clubs. There's a swing analysis that you'll go through to win these clubs, and then a round on one of the best country clubs in the area. So that's the 29th of September. It's at Cantini Golf Course. And I look forward to seeing you there. I stand on the tee box all day long playing one hole. It's called Beat the Scotsman. And whereas I used to be good at golf, and I was particularly good at par threes, my short game was very good. I have not played much since my two sons were born. And the Beat the Scotsman hole, where I stand on the tee box and play all day long, is your chance to really take it out on me and make me feel as inadequate on the golf course as I truly am. So I hope to see everyone there.
Well, yeah, and thank you, Gus. And this Kilted Classic has become the most lucrative of our senior living fundraiser events. And so it's quite successful and just a barrel of fun. I'll rest assured, Gus, I'll be there with my foursome. I knocked myself out a couple of years ago and won a prize for having the most Scottish golf cart. It was all decorated up with heel and coos and all sorts of tartan and so forth, but it's really great fun. So we'll be there, Gus. Hope to see everyone there. Thank you, Gus. Thank you for being here with us and making the time. I just have one more announcement before Cynthia begins. And that is, want to remind everybody that Sir Thomas Devine will be joining our History Forum on October 1st to speak on the subject of mass global immigration from Scotland in the 19th century. So please be certain to mark your calendars for this next month. And so on that happy note, it is time to move forward with our presentation today. And we are delighted to have with us Dr. Cynthia Neville, Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and currently Adjunct Professor in the Department of History at the University of Guelph, Canada. And Cynthia is joining us live from Ontario. And Cynthia, I believe that Jack Sanders and I are ready to turn the program over to you now, please.
Thank you very much. I'll start, if I may, by telling you just a little bit about myself. I did spend many years actually at Dalhousie University as the resident medievalist. That meant I taught European and British history for 1500 at Dalhousie. And then my husband and I, when I retired, decided to move back to Ontario. We're both from Ontario here. And the University of Guelph has a School of Scottish Studies. So it was really an ideal place for me to end up in my retirement.
Excuse me,
Today-
Cynthia, your voice is fading just a little bit. So if you could project just a little bit, it would be great. Thank you.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'm gonna try to.
And that's much better already, much better.
Okay, I'll just make sure I lean forward then. So what I'd like to do today is to bring to you some of the research I've been carrying out on a text that came to have a formative influence on the administration of law and order in the Anglo-Scottish borderlands throughout the later Middle Ages and the early modern period. Now, the short treatise I'll be talking about today has long been referred to in its original Latin as the Leges Marchiarum. In modern works, it's sometimes referred to, it's sometimes known as the Treatise on Border Laws. Now, the text of the treatise, which I'll be referring to very simply today as LM, short for Leges Marchiarum, this text, I think, has much to offer scholars interested both in the operation of the law in medieval Scotland and in the history of juristic thought more generally in the kingdom. So I'm currently engaged in a full-scale edition and commentary on LM, which will be published at some future and right now unknown date by the FSAScot Society, a learned society devoted to the history of Scots law. The origins, elaboration, and operation of the distinctive laws that govern the settlement of disputes in the Anglo-Scottish borderlands, in the period before the Union of 1603, have received close attention by several scholars, and I include here myself doing some shameless self-promoting. Have been written about by people, including myself. And those laws are now pretty well understood. Scholars have asked a few questions, however, about the manuscript witnesses of LM that medieval and early modern lawmen repeatedly acknowledged as the written foundations and indeed authoritative statements of March or border law. They've devoted even less consideration to the place of the LM texts within the broader tradition of the old laws of Scotland, a body of legislation that early modern jurists attributed to the 12th and 13th century kings of Scots, and which they regarded as authoritative, if of uncertain provenance. As I noted a moment ago, my paper draws on research that I've been conducting of late on what now amounts to some 23 extant Latin and vernacular Scots manuscripts of LM. And collectively, this material dates from the late 13th through the late 16th centuries. Today, I will discuss first some of the features of the earliest recensions of the treatise, and second, the place of LM in the efforts of late medieval and early modern lawmen to understand the legal past of the Kingdom of Scotland. From an origin in the later 13th century, I argue, the LM treatise moved through intellectual time and place within the Scottish legal tradition with quite remarkable tenacity and consistency, just indeed as did other medieval law books that scholars such as Hector McQueen and Alice Taylor recently explored. Now, historians have long been familiar with the text known as the Leges Marchiarum. It appears prominently in the first volume of the Acts of the Parliaments of Scotland, published in 1844. Here I'll refer to that as APS. LM purports to record a formal agreement made on the Scottish side of the border in the spring of 1249 by a group of 12 Scottish and 12 English knights under the supervision of the sheriffs of Berwick, Edinburgh, Roxburgh, and Northumberland, whose respective kings had set them the task of putting into writing the laws and customs that had traditionally governed the settlement of disputes in the border region of each of the realms. The meeting itself was the consequence of a series of recent disputes concerning the location of the Anglo-Scottish borderline along the course of the River Tweed, which had arisen in the years following the Treaty of York of 1237. And just in case there are people out there who are not completely familiar with the Anglo-Scottish border region, this is the area I'm talking about here on the map, the area circled. Some years ago, with the editorial practices used in the preparation of Volume 1 of the APS of the Acts of the Parliaments of Scotland under serious scholarly fire, the late Ian Ray published in a miscellany volume of the FSAScot Society a new edition of the Agreement of 1249, an edition that had originally been sketched out in 1902 by the lawyer and scholar George Neilson. Now, while Neilson had admitted that a triple rendering of the text, Latin, Middle Scots, and modern English, would have been ideal, in the end, the treatise appeared only in modern English, allegedly translated from a single Latin exemplar, and in Middle Scots. And that Neilson-Ray edition in turn became the basis of a great deal of subsequent research, beginning with Ian Ray's own classic studies of the administration of the Scottish frontier ages, and more recently then inspiring works by scholars such as Geoffrey Barrow, Summerson, Jackson Armstrong, and himself. The importance of the LM treatise in the context of Anglo-Scottish legal history, and more specifically its place within the old laws tradition, make the examination of the manuscript history of the Leges Marchiarum particularly timely. Working on the assumption that the edition of the LM treatise found in volume 1 of APS, like so many other printed texts of the medieval old laws, is in fact a composite text representing more than one manuscript tradition, I began by identifying witnesses of the treatise known to be of Scottish provenance. And the most important of those manuscripts I've simply listed for you here. There are incidentally 3 further manuscripts of English provenance, but I'm setting those aside for the purposes of today's talk. Full transcriptions of each of the Scottish versions of the treatise reveal a series of interesting features, most of which I'm afraid I haven't got time to go into today, but I can at least fill you in on some of the more important aspects of my ongoing research. So unsurprising was the initial confirmation that the text that's printed in volume 1 of the Acts of the Parliament of Scotland, known as the LM Treatise, is indeed unsatisfactory. Although the editor, Cosmo Innes, stated in his preface that he was printing the treatise without alteration from the single manuscript, that is the so-called Byrne manuscript, which I'll return to in a moment. Elsewhere, the editor relegated to a footnote a statement to the effect that he had, in fact, and again I quote, made 1 or 2 corrections to this text from other authorities. And again, I'll return to this. More surprising and rather dismaying was the finding that Neilson's version of LM, one in modern English and one in Middle Scots, published, as I said, in 1971, are also problematic as authoritative representations of the contents of this text. In the first place, Neilson had crafted his modern English translation on the basis of the flawed text printed in APS 1, believing that the latter faithfully reproduced the text of the 13th century Byrne manuscript. Second, he brought into print a Middle Scots version of the text, transcribed from, in this case, National Library of Scotland Advocates Manuscript 719, datable to the 3rd quarter of the 16th century. Comparison of the Neilson-Ray vernacular text, that original manuscript, however, shows several errors in either Neilson's or Ray's transcription. And as is the case with the Latin version in APS 1, some silent editorial emendations of the original manuscript slide. And I'll show you what I mean here. For example, as you can see here, Neilson replaced a reference to the Bishop of Dunkeld in Advocates Manuscript 719 with a reference to the Bishop of Durham, and omitted altogether the last few words of the relevant passage. Now, I have no doubt, there can be no doubt, I think, that Neilson effected these corrections for the most honest of scholarly reasons. References to the Bishop of Dunkeld in all but the earliest extant manuscripts do in fact perpetuate a fundamental error of transcription, one that appears to have been made in the late 14th century when copying the text of what was to become National Library of Scotland manuscript 21246, the so-called Bute manuscript. A medieval scribe misread the word Donelm and instead wrote Dunkelden. Here you can see on the scribe. This is what the last lines of the Byrne manuscript actually read. This is what was printed. Still again, the earliest Latin version of the LM Treatise, the text breaks off at abruptly, literally in the middle of the word, owing to the loss of a foliar leaf. Gilson silently created a working English translation for this non-existent portion of the original work, woven, if not out of whole cloth, and on the basis of a closing paragraph from a 16th century version. To further complicate matters, neither Nelson nor his later editor, Ian Ray, was aware of the existence of two other Middle Scots recensions of the LM Treatise, one of them earlier than Advocate's manuscript, and now at St. Andrews Library, St. Andrews University Library. The other National Library of Scotland manuscript, accession 11218, collection of documents formerly in the archives of St. Benedict's Abbey at Fort Augustus, and datable to the first quarter of the 16th century. And I guess what I want you to take from all of this admittedly confusing codicology, is the fact that I think it's pretty clear that one can reasonably conclude that reliable editions of both the Latin and the vernacular Scots versions of LM have yet to be produced. So the Byrne manuscript, one folio of which appeared in the title of my talk here today, includes the earliest extant text of the so-called Code of March Law set down in 1249. Now, this text has long been known to historians. Dr. McQueen, for example, has suggested that it was a kind of reference work for a lawyer in the employ of the Balliol family. Bill Scott, another historian, has associated it equally plausibly, I think, with the Earls of Dunbar. The chief importance of this manuscript in the context of my research is the fact that its compiler, because apart from some later editorial insertions, the Byrne manuscript is written in the same hand, considered it important around 1270, when this manuscript was written, to include in his little law book a copy of a border agreement that was by now almost a generation old. Whether he copied this text from a now lost original is not known. There survive, in fact, no extant records, Scots or English, border meeting in April 1249. But that he had a genuine interest in promoting what he believed to be living Scottish custom is more certain. Contemporary records reveal that in the late 13th century, procedures set out in LM were in use on both sides of the border, including the testimony of mixed English and Scottish jurors and recognitors, the establishment of specific levels of compensation with which an offender must redeem or offset his misdeeds, and resort to trial by battle as a method of proof. The frailties associated with the memory of human witnesses threatened the settlement of claims by one party or the other. While the contents of LM relate specifically to the settlement of cross-border disputes, its author nonetheless demonstrates a striking familiarity with practices recently introduced to the kingdom more generally by the Scottish kings William I, died 1214, and Alexander II. The procedures that the treatise requires of a pursuer who claims stolen property as his own, for example, echo the provisions found in the clauses of the treatise known as Leges Scotiae, legal treatise that has been securely dated to the late 12th or early 13th century. More notable still are the distinctions of rank amongst free and semi-free persons that appear in several of the LM clauses that deal with the movement of persons to and fro across the border, and the weight and value accorded to the oaths of pursuers and respondents. These, in turn, accurately reflect the changing nature of freedom and unfreedom in Scotland, and more specifically in the legislation of King Alexander II. One of the last clauses of LM is particularly intriguing in this context. It lays out the ways in which disputed ownership of valuable animals, and it states quite clearly here, oxen, cows, swine, is to be decided, but specifically excludes from its remit the offense of petty theft, described here with the unusual Latin term of sorcina. This last passage would appear to be an allusion to an antiquated category of theft known in Scotland as birth and sake, that by Alexander II's time belonged firmly within the jurisdiction of lordly courts. The text of the LM Treatise, found in the Byrne manuscript, is of interest for many reasons. Most obviously, it captures a moment of close cooperation between England and Scotland that we who enjoy the gift of hindsight know would not endure beyond the closing years of the 13th century. Equally important, some of the passages provide corroboration of the operation within Scotland, legal procedures for which there is as yet scanty documentary evidence for the period. A notable example here is the mention in the earliest LM text of assigns, that is, procedures relating to the excusable non-appearance of an appeller or a defender in court. In the mid-13th century, this term was well known among English lawyers. Assigns, as they were known in England, received extensive treatment in the late 12th century treatise on English law, known as Glanville, and they were the subject of very recent legislation in the English Statute of Marlborough of 1267. Assignees are also mentioned in the earliest extant witnesses of the Scottish Leges Borgorum, or laws of the burghs, which also features in the Byrne manuscript. But the term assignees is not otherwise found in Scotland until well into the 14th century, when it was made the subject of extensive discussion in the substantial legal compilation known as Regiam Majestatem. The LM Treatise then confirms Scottish familiarity with assignees, not in 1249, but at least by the time this manuscript was written, about 1270. Demonstrating in addition a clear understanding of the pragmatic difficulties that attended the satisfactory settlement of disputes involving litigants in the vast area that was the border region. More important still, LM adds to the substance of the nascent Scots law on illicit excuses for non-appearance in court a novel and, as it transpires, a unique statement that in the border region at least, quote, no man may assign himself through death. But the Byrne manuscript was compiled by a lawyer well versed in changes that have been made to Scots law in the previous half century, is exemplified in another passage that governs the pursuit of fugitive napes, the Scottish term for serfs or delays. This passage echoes the wording of an act of Alexander II first made in 1230, but not yet the changes known to have transformed the use of this term by the 14th century. Similarly, the Byrne compiler's familiarity with the 13th century terminology used to describe an unfree or semi-free person, homologius, or manens, or nativus, suggests a writer closely in touch with contemporary discussions about the jurisdiction of kings and lords over persons of low status. Collectively, these passages suggest a compiler who regarded the clauses of the LM Treatise as authoritative representations of contemporary Scottish law. In addition, the fact that together an English Glanville text and an important, again, English statute of 1267 account for more than half the contents of the manuscript shows that well before the end of the 15th century, this compiler at least considered some aspects of English procedural law applicable to the unique conditions of the region. Medievalists of all stripes are familiar with the crucial role law and legal custom played in shaping national identity. The LM text preserved in the Byrne manuscripts adds further evidence, if indeed more is needed, that the process of royal lawmaking in the formative period that was the 13th century involved the articulation of clear statements about the territorial extent of these jurisdictions. The border agreement of 1249, then recorded in the Byrne manuscript, represented the culmination of several consecutive but as yet abortive efforts on the parts of King Alexander II of Scotland, King Henry III of England to agree, first, on the sorts of offences merited specific attention, second, on the ways in which the subjects of one side of the boundary line, agreed to just a dozen years earlier, might secure satisfaction for wrongs done to them by the subjects of the other line. Procedures described in the Byrne manuscript almost certainly derived from practices that were very old in the 13th century. And historians have duly speculated on the antiquity of clauses that prescribe punishments for various cross-border offenses. We've likewise discussed the origins of each of the specific sites stipulated as meeting places or representatives of two crimes, again demonstrating the antiquity of sites as meeting places. While there's no doubt that these places had a long history already in the mid-13th century, few scholars have sought to explain why such a list would appear in an agreement like this in the first place. The list, I suggest, may well have been intended to evoke or to replicate the ancient list of warranting sites that appear in other contemporary manuscripts. Alice Taylor, for example, has shown that in the closing years of the 12th century, warranting sites, once confined to the lands of Old Scotia, north of the Forth, had been expanded to include the territories of Murray and Ross, William I had recently brought under direct control. The invention, and I use that term in its medieval sense, inventio, that is the rediscovery of old custom, rediscovery then of the comparable set of allegedly traditional meeting places in 1249 would certainly have been appropriate in the period following the confirmation in 1237 of a new boundary, distinguishing the lands now recognizably subject to the jurisdiction of the Scottish king from those of his English neighbour. The writer who set out to preserve in the Byrne manuscript an agreement currently reached between Scottish and English recognitors in 1249 may well have copied the text from a now lost exemplar. And as I said earlier, there's otherwise no trace in extant record of this famous meeting of English and Scots at Lakes. This writer, I think, was working to a much broader agenda than merely gathering together a miscellany of English and Scottish legal materials that he might need to use in his, he might need to consult in his practice. Byrne manuscript is not merely a compendium of legal texts. It also bears witness to an appreciation on the part of its author, some 2 generations before the writing of that most famous Scots law book, Regium Majestatem, of the close association between written statements of royal law on the one hand and territorial sovereignty on the other. Whether or not it accurately represented the findings of a border inquest held in 1249, the LM text copied into the Byrne manuscript was intended to make an unambiguous statement about the extent of the Scottish king's jurisdiction over territories now formally acknowledged as lying within the Scottish realm. LM, in short, may be viewed as a piece of Scottish royal propaganda, as much as it is a code of border law. More intriguingly, although it confirmed what a similar inquest in 1248 had found about the status of the marches as the appropriate locus for the settlement of cross-border offences, the message was aimed not so much at the King of England, but at the landholding nobility of Scotland itself. The officials in whose courts accusations were to be heard were those of the sheriff, later the warden of the march, who administered the law on behalf of the king, within lands widely acknowledged as belonging to the king's peace. The border offenders broke, and that border fugitives might under some circumstances seek, was again the peace of the king. The unusual powers granted in the treatise to the Scottish Earls of Dunbar, that is the authority to take securities in the east marches of both realms, transformed these members of this family, this noble family, into crown agents. In LM, aristocratic landholders who elsewhere in Scotland wielded regalian or semi-regalian authority within their lordships, in LM they have only a muted role to play in the administration of march law. They have an obligation to act as pledges. They are the victims of runaway serfs and have the right to pursue them. But if they fail to do so within 40 days, they need to purchase a royal broom to recover. Finally, the fact that the Byrne compiler considered it important to commit to writing the laws and customs of the marches inviolably observed since time immemorial, speaks to an appreciation of the view, widely accepted in Scotland of the mid-13th century, that written acts of royal authority enjoyed an inherent gravitas. In short, the LM Treatise fits comfortably within the tradition of strenuous royal claims to jurisdictional supremacy that has been highlighted in the recent historiography of Scotland in this period. Now, historians have not speculated much about the identity of the filer of the Byrne manuscript, beyond, as I said, tentatively associating them with either burial or Dunbar families. But there's more to be said about the nature of the materials contained in Byrne, specifically in the context of the curious collection of items that it brings together. The author clearly had a deep understanding of the importance of the English Glanville Treatise as a comprehensive effort to set down the laws and legal system of the period in which it was written, the English period in which it was written. And that author also had a profound appreciation of the appropriateness of Glanville as a framework upon which Scottish lawyers might model an equally far-ranging treatise on Scots law. Less than 2 generations later, Glanville's text would, of course, become the basis of that most famous of all the Scottish law books, the FRHistS. Byrne author's inclusion of the text of the English Statute of Marlborough, 1267, is, I think, equally significant. The legal scholar Paul Graham has dubbed it legislation of continuing importance and has suggested that any working law at the time would have considered it an essential component of the law. In this respect, it's important to emphasize the inclusion within the legal miscellany that constitute the contents of the manuscript of a version of the Statute of Marlborough that we know had been sent out of English Chancery very soon after November 1267. The juxtaposition of Glanville and the Statute of Marlborough, both of these fundamental texts of English law, the recently or perhaps newly articulated treatise on the lay of the legal land in the Anglo-Scottish border region, reveals a marked interest on the part of the Byrne compiler in promoting, by association at least, the reputation of the LM Treatise as an authentic and authoritative statement, royally sanctioned Scots law. Certainly more detailed work needs to be done on the relationship between specific passages of this LM, the Byrne LM manuscript on the one hand, and then the other portions of Glanville and other old laws. And that's keeping me very busy these days. But there can be little doubt that LM holds its own as a genuine exemplar of the legal past in the years before King Robert Bruce initiated sweeping reforms to the laws of the realm. Now, for all intents and purposes, as indeed historians are well aware, laws of the marches as articulated in LM soon became irrelevant, moribund, essentially unworkable. After the outbreak of war in 1296, both crowns had to find wholly new ways to address the problem of cross-border crime. Consequences of those efforts was the development of an increasingly sophisticated body of new march law, developed over the course of more than 2 centuries by the wardens of the marches and later experts in civil law and the law of arms. The terms of these agreements were embedded now in the increasingly wordy texts of truces agreed by representatives of the 2 crowns. And incidentally, the texts of those increasingly complex truces, development of this body of march law, was the subject of the first book. Remarkably, in England, LM Treatise sank into utter obscurity, not to be resurrected again until the middle of the 16th century, and only then as a relic of the distant legal past. Although after 1296 there are frequent allusions in extant record materials to the laws and customs of the marches, wartime enmities and the determination of the English king's common law justices to retain exclusive jurisdiction over the northern counties of the realm together put paid to the procedures outlined in the treatise. Scotland, by contrast, different circumstances prevailed. Far from becoming moribund and irrelevant, the LM Treatise went on to enjoy a long, storied life among the Scottish jurists, becoming part of the good old law tradition that underpinned works attributed to David I, the law books of William and Alexander II. Like these other works, LM was copied many times over carefully bound together with other treatises into law books intended for wide circulation, and again, like these other legal texts, occasionally updated and often annotated if lost. The LM of the Byrne manuscripts represents a unique version of the text. That it may have been of more interest to its owner than the other treatises he chose to copy in this manuscript book, perhaps suggested by the illumination of the text. Like other parts of the Byrne manuscript, the vellum is decorated with red and blue initials and rubrics. But unlike those other parts of the manuscript, it includes also a series of elegant marginal decorations, greening, as well as several elaborate manicures and fulcrums, which I pointed out to you. Moreover, quite apart from the English materials that it included, it was bound up with other important Scottish legal materials, including the earliest extant copies of both the Leges Scotiae treatise attributed to King David I, and a portion at least of the laws of the boroughs. LM was not merely a legal curiosity. In the mind of the Byrne compiler, just like those other materials, it bore the imprimatur of authentic old law. This LM is unique in other respects too. As I noted briefly earlier, some clauses mention the bishops St. Andrews and Durham, passages that concern the obligation to offer proof by wager of battle, and that require personal appearance at prescribed meeting places for the settlement of cross-border offences. Between 1270 and the end of the 14th century, when another copy of LM was written and eventually bound into the manuscript, one scribe made a grave error of transcription, and he replaced reference to the Bishop of Durham in the 1270 text with reference instead to the Bishop of Dunkeld. One of the early owners of the manuscript, perhaps Sir John Skene, was quick enough to catch the first instance of what appears to have been a haplographic error, an error of transcription, and made note of it by underlining the word Dunkelden in the first passage, and replacing it with a marginal note that reads Et Dunelum, as you can see here. So the original manuscript had the word Durham in it. Already by the time this manuscript was written, about 1370, this error for Durham has slipped in and Dunkeld has been put in. The corrector of this manuscript, as I said, perhaps Sir John Skene himself, managed to catch the first passage in which the two words were transposed, but he didn't catch the second and third occurrences of this same error. And indeed, in each and every one of the surviving manuscript witnesses, I now have 23 of them, that error is perpetuated. It even found its way eventually into the first printed edition of the Laws of the March by Bishop William Nicholson of Carlisle in 1705. A text dedicated specifically to the settlement of cross-border offences, one realm represented by the Scottish See of St. Andrews, and the other realm represented by the equally Scottish See of Dunkeld makes no sense whatsoever. In its later medieval versions, then, LM can hardly have been of any practical use to a working lawyer, except if we understand that the treatise as a whole was of weightier significance than some of its parts. That LM remained a living text, despite its obsolescence, is again apparent in the last remaining paragraph of the Byrne manuscript. Here, LM addresses the way in which ownership of a disputed ox, cow, or pig is to be proven by requiring that the animal be driven into the River Tweed, with the midpoint of the stream being the deciding line. Now, the Tweed alone is mentioned in the LM of 1270, but in all subsequent manuscript witnesses, Latin Middle Scots or early modern English, the clause in question refers to the midstream lines, both the River Tweed in the East March and now the River Esk in the West March. So in 1249, the date of the first so-called code of law found in Bern, the traditional boundaries of the East March had long been understood to be the midstream of the River Tweed, but those of the West Marches remained as yet unspecified and, as it would transpire, disputed. The situation, though, had changed by the time the manuscript, this Butte manuscript here, was copied out, where LM is next found, written in the later 14th century. So these observations and several others serve as a timely reminder that a close study of all the extant manuscript witnesses of LM is long overdue. So too is the identification of the many features that distinguish its several post-1270 manuscript recensions. Despite the fact that the outbreak of the Wars of Independence doomed many of the provisions of 1249 to redundancy, the LM Treatise itself retained its reputation in the minds of medieval and early modern Scottish jurists as an authentic exemplar of Old Scots law. The sheer number of its extant manuscript witnesses alone is evidence of the esteem in which Scottish lawmen held it. This slide here shows you the list of most of the manuscripts in which LM appears as a distinct text. More relevant still to the argument that LM was regarded and subsequently retained its reputation as authentic old law are the materials with which it became associated in its post-1270 manifestations. Another slide. This slide shows that in the 15th and 16th centuries, LM was frequently included in law books that contained what were then believed to be traditional legal materials, notably law codes associated or attributed, that is, to Kings David I, William I, and Alexander II, and the laws of the sea. In one group of manuscripts, moreover, LM is placed directly after the so-called statutes of King Alexander II, associating them by proximity, not strictly by definition, specific acts of royal legislation in the mid-13th century. Several of the 15th and 16th century manuscript recensions, moreover, make that same connection even more explicit by designating the clauses of the treatise as the, quote, the statutes, 24. Even as additional materials were drafted and added to the LM text, including a new set of border-related ordinances created in 1448, the reputation of LM as an important and authentic legacy of Scotland's legal past. More intriguing still are those manuscripts that repeatedly brought together the LM Treatise, the law codes attributed to David I, William I, and Alexander II, and copies, whole or partial, of Regiam Majestatem. Regiam, I will remind you, was regarded throughout the later Middle Ages as the single most important digest for early Scots law. Compilers of all of these successive 15th and 16th century law books knew as well as we do that the provisions first written down in the Bern manuscript of about 1270 had for all intents and purposes been a dead letter since the outbreak of war between England and Scotland in 1296. And yet they continued to accord the LM Treatise the status of old law, and they clearly considered it appropriate to associate it directly with other written exemplars of royal lawmaking. Here again, I think we have an example of the ways in which some of this manuscript's parts was of weightier significance than its specific provisions. That the LM Treatise remained a living aspect of the legal culture of late medieval Scotland is apparent finally in efforts to translate the work into vernacular Scots. There are at least 3 such manuscripts now extant, all datable to the mid-16th century. All, ironically, demonstrate a conscious, surely paradoxical effort to update parts of the treatise, in some measure to reflect current political conditions, but also to ensure the use of accurate vernacular terminology, and surely also to efface those aspects of the original Latin text that might have signaled its antiquarian tenor, so compromised its historical significance as authentic law. For example, in the vernacular manuscripts, each of the compilers translates the original title of Leges Marchiarum, which itself did not become a regular feature of the manuscript tradition until well into the 14th century. He translated directly into Middle Scots as the laws of the Marches. The names of the 12 Scottish and 12 English recognitors, said to have gathered in 1249, are by the 16th century long past being familiar to readers, and therefore are no longer of any probative value. So they're replaced with more succinct, but also more ambiguous references to the, quote, 24 sworn men who came up with the treatise. In the 16th century, the ability of clerics to prove allegations of theft or homicide was a thing of the very distant legal past, and indeed would have been a fairly noxious concept to contemporary lawmen. Clauses of LM that describe such actions are nevertheless retained in these translations. There are other important changes in these early modern vernacular Scots versions. Thus, references to the long defunct form of surety that appears in the 13th century Latin text of LM as hand warso, self-ironically an old Norse rather than Gaelic derivation. That term disappears altogether in the vernacular manuscripts. By then, terms like hand warso, pledge to have a demand, by then these were relics of the very distant past. Similarly, as you can see here, terms used to identify cross-border pledges, which appear as the words Ingorka and Utagorka in the 13th century LM treatise, become all but unrecognizable in the Middle Scots of the mid-16th century. So Ingorka becomes Imborowe, and Utagorka becomes Imborowe. Still again, older references to man-killing in the Latin texts have been updated in the vernacular versions to the more current manslaughter of the 16th century. And the variety of Latin language terms associated with unfree persons in the 13th century manuscript have been collapsed in the 16th century vernacular texts into the generic Scots term bond of men. Like their later medieval Latin language counterparts, the vernacular versions of LM have had no real role to play in the adjudication and settlement of cross-border offenses. Nevertheless, the venerable reputation of the treatise itself as authentic old law enabled LM to make a seamless transition from Latin into the vernacular, and as has been shown for at least one of these Scots recensions, to circulate widely among amateur, apprentice, professional lawmen. Arrangements for the adjudication of cross-border offences evolved continuously after the outbreak of war in 1296, with the Scottish Parliament occasionally weighing in with statutes designed to provide the wardens with the powers they required to administer March law, especially under King James I. The stuff of James's legislation, in particular, makes it quite clear that by 1430, provisions for cross-border dispute settlement first recorded in the Byrne manuscript had long ago become unworkable. The ordinances of 1448, that I mentioned briefly earlier, in fact represented an effort to elaborate the arrangements that had been made by James I's Parliament. Like LM, and despite of its title, 1448 treatise was not an act of war legislation. It was more technically a confirmation of a series of wartime measures proclaimed by the wardens of the Scottish West March. It dealt at length with the conduct of fighting men, punishment for colluding with the enemy, the management of prisoners of war, ransom taking. All of these matters said to have originated in the wartime conditions of the late 14th century. Within just a few years of their genesis, however, provisions of 1448 achieved the status of settled, not genuinely old law. Thus, several of the later manuscript witnesses of LM also include copies of the ordinances of 1448. Here see several of the LM texts also pair up the ordinances of 1448. So like the original treatise, the stuff of the 1448 document was eventually rendered obsolete by new arrangements, the settlement of cross-border crime. But like LM, the text itself lived on as a legal artifact for 200 years. While the clauses of the 1249 agreement, on their own, or with their post-1448 accretions, bore an ever-diminishing reaction or relation to the realities of legal practice in the Anglo-Scottish border region, the LM treatise never truly became moribund. It continued to be copied, studied, translated, and eventually printed as an authentic exemplar of Old Scots law. More important, LM appears to have occupied a secure place in the efforts of late medieval and early modern jurists to elucidate the legal past of the Kingdom of the Scots. In 1566, the Scottish lawyer David Chalmers, the author of a compendium of ancient Scots law, borrowed passages directly from the LM treatise in his discussion of the laws particular to the border region. Like many of their contemporaries, these men, so too after him, I should say, did the jurists Sir James Balfour and Henry Sinclair in the notes and commentaries called practics that were the precursors of modern law reports. Like many of their contemporaries, these men were part of the judicial movement, the aims of which were to understand the relationship between genuine parliamentary legislation, ancient texts and collections of laws, among them the law codes of David I, William, and Alexander II, other briefer treatises like LM, and above all, Regium Majestatem itself. All of these texts were revered as legacies of the Middle Ages, and thus as emblems of Scotland's hard-won status as a distinct kingdom. Modern scholarship has framed several efforts aimed at reforming the laws of Scotland, one initiated in 1425 and 6, two others attempted in 1469 and 73, and a renewed effort launched in the late 1560s. So modern scholarship has framed these several projects aimed at reforming Scots law as a conflict between profound respect on the part of jurists, the texts of the distant medieval past, and the authority of statute law enacted by the king, or queen, and councillors in Parliament. Glance at the date and the manuscript compilations in which LM is found is suggestive of a compelling connection to the timing of the reform commissions. And I'm putting back up here a slide showing where some of these Scottish recensions are. Many of them coincide with these efforts in bringing together the old texts. Certainly, the jurist's veneration of the old laws as a body of learning legitimately sanctioned by immemorial tradition was in the sense a vital aspect of an ongoing discussion amongst early modern legal humanists in Scotland about the nature of legal authority itself. That too is a topic that has been the subject of a great deal of recent scholarly discussion and debate. The intellectual ferment of the 15th and 16th centuries, I think, explains the enduring appeal of the LM treatise, despite the obsolescence of its contents. We can, I think, accept the premise that a lawyer in the employ of the royal family or the Earls of Dunbar copied into the law book that later became known as the Broom Manuscript, text of a border agreement that represented more or less accurately the customs that obtained in the Anglo-Scottish marches of this time. We must also, however, understand that after 1296, wartime conditions rendered most of the provisions of 1249 unworkable and indeed irrelevant. So we're left then with the problem of explaining why medieval and early modern jurists maintained this keen an interest in this legal relic, as they obviously did, situating the manuscript tradition of the little treatise known as Marchiarum firmly within the wider intellectual world of late medieval and early modern juridical thought goes some way, I think, towards explaining the startlingly long life of this treatise. That too is part of the research project that I'm involved in. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Bravo, bravo, and thank you, Cynthia. I would like to open the floor to question, answer, commentary. And while people are becoming a little organized, Cynthia, I just would like to commend you on undertaking this rather daunting task of identifying and documenting artistic license assumed by various editors who made so-called corrections to the LM. This is such important work in support of ensuring accuracy of the documented medieval and modern law. So, I mean, thank you for this effort and this project.
You're welcome. I mean, part of the real interest in studying texts of medieval law is that they're not just slavishly copied down. The scribes who copy these things down are inputting some of their own thoughts and their own translations, as you were, into them as they copy them out. So the codicology itself, the history of the texts themselves, is really, really interesting, quite apart from what the texts say, but the texts themselves and how they move through time and space.
Absolutely. You know, I would think this is just a yet another example, too, of Scottish thought and intellectual achievement long before Scotland's Enlightenment period of the 18th and early 19th centuries. We were talking with David Worthington recently about this up at the University of the Highlands and Islands, who's been undertaking some research on early intellectual work, you know, long before the 18th century so-called Enlightenment. Comments or questions for Cynthia?
Once again, I've learned something new that I didn't even know about. And I loved all that information on the borders and that the two countries were working together to come up with something that they were both agreeing on. But to do it to do that research, as Connie has mentioned, from such a long time ago in those books is amazing. Thank you.
Well, it's not happening very fast. This is my retirement project, so don't hold your breath, but it'll get done.
Don't be shy, everyone. You're usually not shy. Cynthia, I want you to be sure and let us know when the book is published so that we can all jump out there and buy some copies.
I'll let you know. I don't know if you folks are familiar with the Stairs Society publications. Stairs Society is a legal history society dedicated to the history of Scots law. They've been publishing, I think, since the 1930s, volumes on various aspects of Scots law. So it'll be in one of those volumes.
Is everyone dumbfounded?
I could talk a little bit about where the manuscripts are almost all in Scotland.
That would be great.
I recently discovered one in Harvard Law School library, so I've added that to my list. They're mostly in Scotland. There are a few of them in England. In fact, the manuscript was still being copied in England in the 16th century, which it only makes sense if you appreciate this as a document that itself was being looked at by jurists.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious, Cynthia, you've done a lot of work in law, in the field of law. What steered your interest in that direction to begin with? I've not had a chance to ask you about that.
So, a professor I went to a university called Carleton University in Ottawa, where I grew up, in central Canada here. And I had a prof there who taught me medieval history, and then I did my master's degree with him. was an English legal historian. And so he really got me interested in legal history. And then I decided to do more or less legal history for the PhD in Scotland, because back then in the early 80s, there was hardly any work done on Scotland. It was still a rich field for study, because it's less studied than English medieval history. That's what, it was literally a prop that got me into it.
And have you had to master the Latin language to pursue these? Yes, I would think so.
Yes, the documents I was showing you are all in Latin. So you need to have some Latin. It's easier to have the Latin before you start, so you can read the text. You have to learn the paleography then. If you haven't got the language, it's difficult to learn the paleography. So yes, you do need it.
We've got
Yes.
comments in the chat here. If you'd like me to read those out.
Thank you, please.
So Jack McLennan says, speaker is undoubtedly very knowledgeable, but legal topics are over my head. Dr. Technically.
Well, I mean, this is true. This is a topic that one has to specialize in. But one of the reasons I find Scottish legal history so interesting is there's an assumption that it's just a version of English common law, and it isn't. I mean, Scottish common law in the Middle Ages really is partly made up of English procedural law. There's an awful lot of Gaelic custom that comes into it as well. So yeah, it's a specialized topic, but it's like anything. Read up a little bit about it, and be amazed what you come up with.
Jack, I believe Gus wrote something.
Yep, and Gus says, excellent presentation, all caps, excellent. Thank you, Cynthia. I need to drop off now. Everyone be well.
Oh,
I actually have a question. Are there parts of Scottish law that have been lost to history that how well documented is it really?
It's not as well documented as English law. So there
Right.
are central government records, if I can put it that way, for relating to English legal procedures dating literally from the 1190s. So there was quite a bit of stuff, of records as it were, and they were mostly kept in Edinburgh Castle, where they were archived because we have lists of what was in there. Edward I came in 1296 and carried the records off to England and destroyed them. So frustratingly, we have a list we have an inventory of what was in that treasury and what legal documents were in there, only to be told that they're, by the way, they're gone. So studying Scottish law means you spend a lot more time with charters, land documents, land deeds. You spend a lot of time on literally anything you get your hands on, because there isn't a series of steady record materials, at least until the very late 15th century. So one of the skills you learn is to find law in just about anything you can.
We know what we don't know, though.
Oh, we certainly know what we don't know. And that's the real challenge. And again, I mentioned the fellow by the name of probably the most knowledgeable legal history writer right now. His argument has always been that the Scots drew on English common law, the structure, content, and reasoning draw much more heavily on Roman civilian tradition. So Scots common law is this interesting blend of two very different traditions.
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time, Cynthia? I think you dropped out there for a second.
The assumption once was that Scottish law was simply a poor version, well, a more primitive version of English common law. And scholars like Hector McQueen have shown that no, in fact, Scots law drew part on Gaelic custom, drew on English law as a way to sort of structure its own series of briefs, and things. But it also drew heavily on the Roman civilian tradition, because most of its scholars were educated at European universities. So there was an awful lot more civilian influence in Scots law than there was in English.
Thank you.
It's interesting that these go back to the 13th century. I'm sure you, as I've often found myself frustrated over the prehistoric period and the lack of history and documentation, written documentation. I wish, I don't know, I just wish that weren't the case.
Well, you know, for my MA thesis, I was studying with this English scholar, and I looked at the system of criminal trials in the north of England. It was divided up into legal circuits, and I was looking at the northern circuit. And you know, my whole MA thesis was 20 years worth of criminal trial records from the north of England in the 15th century, because there was enough for all kinds of MA students to do that sort of work. In PhD, as I say, you get your mitts on whatever you can, and try to reconstruct from there. So it's a bit more of a challenge. The good news is there's less stuff to look at. Oh. I always thought that about modern historians. They have way too much paper to get through.
Any other comments for Professor Neville today?
I did put my email address up in the last little note there. If anyone's got questions or follow-up, you're welcome to email me.
And if you need her address, please reach out to Jack or I. Okay, well, I believe we can go ahead and close today, Cynthia. Everybody is just, I think, a little bit mesmerized by your expertise, but really fascinating. And we can't thank you enough for being here and this really value-added work that you're undertaking. And Jack, I just want to thank you for all you do. And really thanks to all of you for joining and being steadfast and being part of this history forum, which is so important in not only keeping Scottish culture and intellectual pursuits alive in America, but just in the pursuit of knowledge in general. So we hope we'll see you all next month, same time, same station. And until then, thank you and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Really appreciate this.